Hello there everyone, uxwbill here once again, and today for the duration of this video we are going to be talking about computers. In fact, we are probably going to be talking about computers to the point of reaching a nauseating level of talking about computers. You may not think it's possible to do too much talking about computers, but after you've watched this video you might change your mind. And while I'm on the subject, before I get on to the rest of this video, I would like to take a moment to mention that while I will gladly consider almost any reasonable video request, please don't make open-ended video requests along the lines of, I want to see more videos about computers, or I want to see more videos about cars. If you've got something that you'd like to see a specific video about, by all means, certainly send it on to me and I will consider it. But as far as open-ended video requests are concerned, well, if you don't see what you like to see right now on this channel, it will come around again in time. Moving on to the meat and potatoes of this video. Some of you might remember quite a while ago when I filled my station wagon full of white box clone computers, all of which were Athlon XP machines that were cast off from my previous place of work in late 2012. And I ended up with all of those machines. Most of them have been sitting in storage ever since, but I actually dug one of them out recently to engage in a little trip down memory lane. A little trip down memory lane involving, if I don't knock everything over here and open up menus that I don't intend to be opening, a little trip down memory lane involving what was probably the best release of Windows ever, Windows 2000 Professional. I realize that opinions might differ on this matter, but I'm not really interested in hashing it out in the comments, so if you disagree, that's fine, but let's keep it courteous. I've been playing around with Windows 2000's various unofficial updaters and actually enabling a lot of modern software to run on the once forgotten Windows 2000 system. Well, it just so happens that in the course of playing with these systems, these old Athlon XP machines, I've been compelled to dig into the hardware a little bit. As you can see in this particular wallpaper here, which is pretty neat looking, isn't it? This machine actually got a dedicated video card to try and improve performance from the stock onboard VIA S3G KM400 video subsystem. And it did help a little bit, but Flash Player 14, which will actually run on Windows 2000 with all of the unofficial updates in place, is still definitely more than a bit of a pig, and so it still keeps the CPU usage at about 86 to 97%, depending upon what I'm watching. And that's watching 360p video here on YouTube, not watching high definition or anything like that. Now granted, if I was using a GPU a little bit newer than an NVIDIA GeForce FX 5500, which Max Arcade was kind enough to send me in a whole big box of computer stuff a long time ago, the performance would probably be better. I also went ahead and upgraded the RAM on this machine to 1 gigabyte. But in the process of tooling around with these machines, and inspired mainly by YouTube's lackluster performance, I began to think about figuring out what the best supported processor on this machine's particular motherboard would be. This is an Asus A7V400-MX SE motherboard in this machine, and the one right next to it is much the same thing. In fact, to the untrained eye, the two boards would look exactly the same, and they would be except for one thing. This one's got a slightly different model number. Check that out. Even though everything about this board is visually the same as the A7V400-MX SE in that machine over there, this board has a key difference in its functionality that I discovered quite by accident. You see, back when all these machines were built, it was my understanding that they were all Athlon XP 2500 machines. And boy, did I get a surprise recently. I can't remember exactly what led up to my doing this, but I was thinking about buying an upgraded microprocessor for this computer over here, running the unofficially updated version of Windows 2000, and I decided that maybe I'd better check what I have while I was in the process of actually exchanging offers and counter offers with a seller on eBay. And when I popped the heatsink off of the microprocessor, I was very, very surprised at what I found. I'll go ahead and turn this monitor on here on the Windows 8 machine, and I'll show you what I found. Take a look at this. This is a close-up picture of the motherboard right here. And if we scroll down a little bit, you can see I've got the heatsink off of the microprocessor. And take a look at that processor identifier label. You see what that says? AXDA3200DKV4E? Well, if you think that's not an Athlon XP 2500 Plus, you're absolutely right. I haven't checked all of these machines yet, but this one at least, and this one, and some of the others that I've looked at out of the 14 or so that I've got in storage, all have Athlon XP 3200 Plus processors. Pretty much the highest performing processor ever made for the Socket 462 platform, and yet it was underclocked on all these motherboards. Why in the world would that be? Well, I'll tell you what I found out completely by accident. First I was thinking some kind of, conspiracy theory, although what kind of a conspiracy could there possibly be? Usually if a computer builder is going to commit fraud, they're going to specify a lesser part and then overclock it, or even patch the system software so that it reports a lesser part as being a higher end one. And that's not the angle here, folks. This is a more capable part running at a lesser speed. And these machines don't have any thermal issues or anything like that. I mean, they're not full tower cases. They're a mini mid-tower case kind of a thing. Probably a mid-tower, since there's 3 5¼ inch bays up here and extra 3½ inch internal bays inside. But there's definitely not a thermal problem here. No, the problem is a lot more subtle than that. It turns out that the A7V8X-MX SE motherboard that's in some of these machines can't handle running at a 200 megahertz base clock. Oh, you can try to set it using this bank of DIP switches back here that you might be able to see, and the system's clock generator definitely supports it. But if you set it, the system will not perform its power on self-test. Well, conversely, the A7V400-MX SE motherboard in this machine runs perfectly at the 200 megahertz processor base clock setting. So Asus must have made a slight improvement or change to these systems that allowed the newer board, the A7V400-MX, to work at the specified speed. And what's more interesting than that, if you happen to look at this picture, you'll see that there's a sticker identifying this board's model number between the 2 PCI slots. I'll bet you can guess what that sticker might be covering up. So that was a nice little performance booster to find out about. Anyway, these systems have done a relatively good job during the time that they were in use. They are kind of a low-end thing, especially today, about 10 years after they were assembled in the middle of 2004. But they've done well over the years. I haven't really had a lot of trouble with them. A grand total of 2 of them died. One of them lost both of its ATA channels, and another one was working normally one day when all of a sudden it just hung up solid, and when I switched it off and turned it back on again, it was gone. And no amount of memory or CPU swapping or power supply checking would bring it back to life. In fact, there really wasn't anything wrong with any of the parts that I removed from that machine, so it just ended up dying one day. And as for the one with the 2 dead ATA channels, well, I probably could have just installed a PCI ATA or serial ATA card in the machine and gotten it running, but we elected to replace it at the time. Now, that's not to say that these boards were without their quirks. In fact, they do have a little bit of strange behavior. I'll go ahead and shut this machine down and show you some of what I mean here. One of the things that I've noticed about these boards in particular is that the keyboard and mouse ports on them are always hot. This machine just turned its power off, but you can see that the Model M keyboard here still indicates having power, and that could be a risky situation if you go disconnecting things from the mouse and keyboard ports while thinking that they're truly not powered. It's unlikely, but you could pooch the motherboard by doing that. So we'll go ahead and turn this machine truly off here, and you'll see that in a couple of moments the power supply capacitors will discharge and the standby power supply will stop operating. Go ahead and show you something about these machines that's very strange. I've never seen another motherboard that does this when it's turned on, and I don't know if it's working around some kind of a bug in the hardware. I don't know if maybe it's trying to make sure that the internal state of some of the board's logic is set correctly, or whatever might be going on with it. Go ahead and get these cables hooked up here, hopefully quickly, because you know the camcorder is rolling here. Alright, we got everything hooked up except the power cord. Now I've got that hooked up. Go ahead and turn this machine on, and as you can see, it's got a nice little standby LED on the motherboard. And one of the biggest quirks that I noticed about these machines, if you don't configure the devices attached to the ATA channels just so, they will not be recognized by the system board. And I don't know if that's a bug in the VIA chipset. I mean, VIA chipsets, although they were good for the time, they don't hold the best reputation, and because of legal action by Intel, VIA is basically completely out of the chipset business today for both AMD and Intel products. The only thing that they continue to make chipsets for are their own low-power CPUs, which also aren't terribly current. But watch what happens and listen very carefully when I apply power to this board, and you'll see that it does something very, very strange that no other motherboard I've ever played with does. And it's not just an isolated incident. All 14 of these machines that have Asus boards in them, which is all but one of them was a spare and has a MicroStar board in it because it was ordered much later, do this same thing. That's right, when you power it up from a cold start after applying power to the power supply for the first time, the board shuts itself off and then turns itself right back on. But here's the interesting thing. It will go and do the same thing if you actually force the power to turn off. It went ahead and booted into the Ultimate Boot CD that I left inside the CD-ROM drive here. So we'll go ahead and turn it off and let everything spin down. Now watch, it'll be the one time it doesn't do it on video here, make a fool of me. But if you force the machine's power to turn off, it will do the same bizarre brief power on, power down, and then power up once again. I didn't do it. Like I say, I don't fully understand the circumstances under which that takes place, and I've also noticed that if you leave the standby power on long enough, it won't do that bizarre power cycle either. So I don't know if it's some sort of a quirk in the VIA North Bridge or the South Bridge or this machine's power control logic, but I do know that it happens nevertheless, and it's certainly unique and very interesting. Wow! I have done a lot of sitting here and bantering about these machines, and they aren't even the focus of this video. No, I'll tell you what the focus of this video actually is. We're going to do a computer build today. I'll be right back to tell you more about it. Alright, I'm back almost instantly thanks to the magic of video editing. The still that you're looking at right now is a scene from a Max Arcade video that he shot in February of 2012. This is a look inside his music player computer. He upgraded it around that time. It was a rather serious upgrade at that particular point in time. And as you'll see in just a moment, the board in that video still should look very familiar as soon as I get this compact disc off of it. That's right, not long after Max Arcade made that video, I approached him about purchasing the old motherboard from his music player computer, along with the memory and processor that were on it. We arrived at an agreement, and I ended up buying the board. It's a very nice Intel board, an Intel D865 GBF, I believe it is. Got a nice amount of PCI slots on it. And after I bought it, I never got around to doing anything with it. Oh, I kept saying, you know, one of these days, I'm going to do something with that board, but I just never got off my butt and did it. And I just noticed something in that particular video still. If you look closely at the video card in his music player machine at the time, it looks very familiar. Maybe not to you, but it certainly looks very familiar to me. What do you want to bet? That is the same video card from his music player machine. It has to be. The tall capacitors on it, the style of the fan and heatsink. That thing actually lights up, by the way, which I'm sure makes it about 20% faster than competing graphics cards, which do not light up. I guess the two parts have ended up not very far away from one another. We got the motherboard over here and the graphics card over in the Windows 2000 project machine, which, if you were paying attention earlier, you will notice that motherboard is exactly the same. Even though it's a different model, it is visibly the same as the one you just saw a couple of minutes ago. So what finally gave me the encouragement to go ahead and start assembling this computer? Well, of all things, it was a power supply. was at the Goodwill recently, and I found this. A very nice AGI, which is actually another name for High Pro, as you can see from the model number there, HP. Also, if you look inside it, you will see parts such as transformer coils that are marked as High Pro. This is a 400-watt power supply. I did take a look inside it. There's no sign of bloated capacitors. I've tested it. It seems to work just fine. And best of all, it cost me about $7 when everything was said and done. And you really can't beat that for a 400-watt power supply. There's only one thing about it that I find slightly questionable, and I don't know how well it's going to show up here on video, but if you look, you can see that the primary rectifier package inside this power supply doesn't have any kind of a heat sink. It's just pressed against the circuit board. And that's one thing I'm not really fond of with these power supplies that use an extra large fan like this one does, because in order for that fan to fit in, they cut down on the amount of metal and heat sink assemblies that are placed inside the power supply. So if that fan ever quits working, not that it should, because big fans like that can turn much more slowly and last a lot longer as a result, but if it ever did quit running for any reason, you would be in trouble and things would probably go bang, and you'd be at the mercy of the power supply's protective circuitry. The thing that amazes me the most about this is that someone replaced it with a slightly larger supply, a 500-watt Dynex, which is a Best Buy house brand for those of you who are not located in the United States and might not be aware of that. And while I suppose that the Dynex power supply could be perfectly fine depending upon who made it, I would certainly think this was the better power supply of the two. But going back to the motherboard here and the case, this is an enclosure from one of the two Athlon XP machines that died while in service at my place of work. I don't remember which one this was, but I think it was the one that just dropped dead out of the blue one day while it was powered on. And this enclosure's been sitting around for quite a while. Now, this isn't a particularly fancy case, not a real high performance case when it comes to ventilation or looks or anything like that. But the one thing that I absolutely like in a computer case is good build quality, easy disassembly, and subdued looks. And these cases have it all. These cases were made by a company known as Case Edge. I think that Case Edge, C-A-S-E-D-G-E, in case you're wondering how it was spelled, with a long pronunciation mark over the A so that there wouldn't be any doubt, was later swallowed up by Foxconn, I believe. And in fact, these cases do show signs that their assembly was done by Han High Precision on 20th March of 2004. And since this is such a nice case, I don't know what happened to the case for the other machine that died. It might have had something else built into it, but as you can see, parts were picked off of this machine to keep the other ones running, well, since they were in a lot better health than it was. And since this case seemed so nice that I didn't really want to throw it out, I thought that I would go ahead and finally take this motherboard from Max Arcade and do a little computer build. You see, there are some people in the past who have requested a video along these lines, and I don't usually make videos unless I feel that I can produce something that's worth someone's time. Now, I know I'm kind of a long-winded individual, and some of you might be getting on me for the amount of rambling I've been doing in this video without actually building anything yet. But I always like to tell the backstory so that people can understand the logic and the rationale behind my decisions, because sometimes people wonder what it is I'm doing a certain thing for, or exactly what it is that I have in mind. Another nice thing about this case that you might be able to see, it's got a Windows XP certificate of authenticity on the back. And that leads up to my intended purpose for this machine. I think I'm going to do something with this that I have not done in a very, very long time. I think I am going to set up a Windows XP and a Linux, probably Linux Mint, dual boot situation with this machine. Now granted, this is older hardware and it might draw sneers from the high performance crowd, but then again, this doesn't have to be high performance. And even today, a machine like this, based on a motherboard like this, can deliver a very solid amount of performance for basic work and even a lot of web browsing and things like that. About the only thing it's not going to be good for is video rendering, 3D stuff, and high-end gaming. And I don't have any of that in mind. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to make a cursory examination of this case and just make sure that everything seems to be okay. Because this thing's been sitting around for a while and you just never know what could be going on with stuff inside it. If you ever decide to repurpose a computer case of your own for another build, one thing to definitely check is to make sure that all of these spacers are in places where the motherboard actually has a hole. Now this is a lot less of a problem here in these modern ATX and ITX and similar days, but way back in the days of baby AT motherboards and similar, you could really ruin your day and really ruin a motherboard if you happen to put a standoff of the metal type where there wasn't a hole in the motherboard. It could short to components and their solder traces on the other side of the board, and that was usually lights out time for the motherboard. But in this case, I checked everything out. Everything seems to be in good shape. So we're going to go ahead and set the motherboard in here. Now back when I bought this motherboard, hopefully I can do this one-handed. I may have to think about that. I may want to shut the camcorder off and do this, just in case I do something dumb. Yeah, I think I'm going to go ahead and do that. It'll be a lot easier to do it two-handed, especially working with these tabs around the I/O shield. So I'm sorry to those of you who wanted to see me actually put this motherboard in the case. I'm going to have to pause the camcorder in order to do it. Okay, I've got the motherboard in the case right now. Really don't have much of anything hooked up other than the power LED, and only then just as a kind of way to keep those cables handy and things like that. I don't even know if that's hooked up properly right now. I was surprised to see that in the case of this motherboard that the power LED is actually in a separate location as compared to the rest of the front panel connections. I'll have to look at the manual to get those hooked up. The other thing I'll have to look at the manual to do, well, I take that back. One thing that is true of some of these cases and not others, there are definitely subtle differences to these, so apparently they were making running changes to the production over time. Some of them have USB front panel leads that are completely separated from one another, but apparently this case does not, and I didn't realize that, so that's going to make my work a whole lot easier. There's two of those because there's two front panel USB ports. One thing that I'm probably not even going to bother with is the front panel audio on these cases. If there was a bad thing I could say about these cases, and there's only two, this would be the first of the two, is the fact that these front panel audio cables are nowhere near long enough. Plus I would have to go, I would have to go all the way back here. And that's a pretty tight stretch. It'd infringe on some of the PCI slots, and I would also have to remove a couple of jumpers from the onboard audio in order to enable the front panel to work. And since I never use these connectors anyway, I don't think I'm going to worry about them. I'll just tuck them out of the way someplace. Maybe I'll even see if I can remove them from this case totally. Now, as far as the assembly goes, things are going pretty well here. I've got the motherboard in place, which was definitely a two-hand job. And while I suspect that most of the people watching this particular video are by no means new to the process of assembling a computer into a case, I'll go ahead and pass along a few tips in case anyone here happens to be. Not only do you have to watch out for the spacers and make sure they're only in the place where they belong, because as you can see in this bag of parts right here, there are some extra spacers, and if you're reusing a previously enjoyed case, you may find that someone put spacers in a completely inappropriate area. And like I said during the previous segment, that will kill your motherboard dead in all likelihood. So don't take a chance. Look very carefully, check and double check. Take a photograph and then photograph the case, photograph the motherboard, and use some kind of a photo editing program to overlay the two, if you think you have to do it that way. One thing that was a subject of some trouble during this installation process was the I/O shield for the motherboard. Now, I'm sure that Max Arcade probably sent me this when he sold me the board, but somehow it and the board got separated, so I later found another one on eBay, and as my luck would have it, I managed to lose that one too. Well, luckily I had a computer in the background here that has a similar board to this in it, also from Intel, but slightly shorter and suffering from seriously blown capacitors that had the same I/O shield. So 3 I/O shields later, here we are. I've got one in this case that worked, and I put it in here long before I was ready to do this assembly because I wasn't going to go through 3 of them. That's just absolutely insane. Speaking of capacitors, this board's caps are all in pretty good shape. I've seen a number of these boards that had blown capacitors in the past. In fact, I've even recapped one. And while the ones around the microprocessor themselves are a common point of failure, this big cap over here, I've seen it fail as well. And I really think that a lot of that might have to do with perhaps questionable case ventilation. Wow, I can't even pronounce my words tonight. One thing that this board has on it, I don't know which CPU this has got. Max Arcade's video, which I've kind of been rewatching over here to remind myself of what transpired over 2 years ago and how this board was equipped. He mentioned that this thing had a higher-end socket 478 Pentium 4. So I would guess it's at least a 2.8 gigahertz processor, maybe a little faster than that even. But one thing's for sure, whoever made this nice heatsink and fan assembly, and I don't see any markings on it as to a manufacturer or a model or anything like that. This thing is very serious. I really wonder if this is not an aftermarket fan, because it's only screwed in at 2 sides on each end of the fan. I don't know if maybe there wasn't enough cooling going on here, but a fan like this definitely ought to keep that processor good and cool. As far as RAM goes, that was basically the thing as I remember it. Max Arcade wanted to recover the investment he'd made in the RAM more than he did the motherboard or anything like that. These are each 512 megabyte modules for a total of 2 gigabytes worth of RAM on this board, if I'm remembering things correctly. I don't think there could possibly be any more memory than that. As far as I know, this board has a 4 gigabyte maximum. If not by chipset limitations, then certainly by practicality, because as far as I'm aware, there are essentially no socket 478 Pentium 4 or Celeron processors other than perhaps the Gallatin Core Extreme Editions or maybe some server class ones, but I really don't know. I'm going to keep it simple and say that I don't think there are any 64-bit capable socket 478 processors. And if I'm wrong, I'm sure somebody will call me on that in the chat. As far as video goes, chat? Wow, I'm confusing live streams with video making here. In the comments area, I'm sorry. I'm going to go ahead and use the onboard integrated video. That should be more than powerful enough for my needs. We'll see. I've got a couple of AGP cards kicking around here if I think I need something a little more powerful than that. I'm going to go ahead and install a couple more screws to hold this motherboard in place. Now again, if you're doing something like this for the first time, let me see if I can get a little more light over here. Or maybe pull the light on the floor and produce a splendid crash. When you're doing this, especially if you're doing it for the first time, I would fasten all the screws on the motherboard in just a slightly tight fashion. Now you'll notice I've installed an option card back here. It's a telephone line modem, which I wouldn't have much use for in this day and age. That's just to help keep things lined up while I'm putting all the screws in. It's unlikely, especially in a well-made case, that you'd ever have a problem with this. And doing this one-handed is needlessly difficult. I'm not putting in all these screws one-handed. I know some of you out there probably wanted to see me do this whole thing start to finish, but I'm not going to risk damaging perfectly good hardware in order to accomplish that goal. So we'll see if I can do this one over here back by the expansion slots. I don't want it to fall into the nether regions of this case, but it doesn't look like it's going to. Looks like the assembly is going remarkably well so far. Which means that undoubtedly I'm overlooking something. There's got to be something I'm missing here, because when I realize that whatever it is I'm missing has transpired or not transpired, such as the case may be, I will undoubtedly realize that this hasn't gone anywhere near as well as I thought it has. I'll also take a moment before I forget. The processor fan's already plugged in. I'll go ahead and plug in a cooling fan for the rear panel. I noticed that this motherboard has not just one rear fan connection that's labeled as such, but there's another one over here just north of the CPU socket that also says rear fan, and my guess is that perhaps that connector is populated on the short version of this board. There's a version of this board that only has 3 PCI slots and thus is a micro ATX form factor. I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of these screws in and tighten them down. I started to talk about the modem, and I don't think I really mentioned its purpose, but in case I did, I'll be repeating myself. The modem in the slot here is just to help keep things aligned, which should not be a problem in a decently made case such as this. Now, there's just one very minor problem caused by having that modem in place in the PCI slot. I happen to overlook this screw that goes right here between the network interface controller and the jumpers for the onboard sound and the front panel connections, which as previously mentioned I'm not using. But I've got that sucker in there now, or in my typical bizarre sense of humor style of expression, you're screwed now, sucker! So let's see what else I've been doing. I managed to get the power supply fastened into place here. That's nicely in place now. This is not the most well-designed case for this particular style of power supply, but it should do. There's still more than enough room for ventilation back here. Now the other thing that I want to go ahead and do, when Weasel 2 HTM came up here a while back, he was kind enough to bring me some cast-off optical drives, and they are very much appreciated. I can always put optical drives to good use, especially in a machine like this that originally shipped with only a CD-ROM drive in place, because let's face it, in this day and age, practically every piece of software that you install from an optical drive is going to be on a DVD. Let's see if I can actually get this out of here single-handed. It's not wanting to cooperate so far. I'm not having much luck with it. And that is the second aspect of these case edge cases that I'm none too fond of. You see, like many similar cases, these things actually make use of a quick installation system. And I've got to give them credit. At least they didn't use annoying proprietary rails that would be all but unobtainable after all these years. They did, however, do something slightly bizarre, and I'll show it to you as soon as I get this drive out of here, which might involve some swearing. And I'm going to go ahead and edit that out, because this is supposed to be a reasonably family-friendly channel. Here's what conspires to make the quick drive installation methodology used by this case so annoying. As previously mentioned, there are no difficult-to-find rails or anything like that. The thing that makes this a little bit annoying are these screws. Now, they're a standard type, at least as far as the part that threads into the drive is concerned, and that shouldn't be too hard to find. It's probably not too hard to find these at any good hardware store, as a matter of fact, but they are definitely a fair bit off the beaten path and something that the average computer tinkerer is not likely to have in their collection unless they have one of these cases kicking around. Luckily, no swearing was required to remove this optical drive from the machine. Just took a little bit of cajoling. It was a two-hand job, one to press down the black release lever inside the case, and the other one to gently kind of slap the drive out of place. It was wanting to bind up a little bit on the screw here, which is why you do not use similar but slightly different screws with this case, because they will jam up and cause you a world of heartache. And please, please, please don't ask how I know that, because yes, I used more standard computer screws one day when I could not find any of the specialty screws that are used to hold this into the case. On the other side of the drive, there are no screws in place. You know, it just occurred to me I might have left a CD in here. I really hope I didn't do that, though. Now, it doesn't really matter how this old drive was jumpered, because this is a completely different motherboard. And since we're probably going to go ahead and put this drive on its own separate parallel ATA channel, I might re-jumper it to cable select, but for now I'm just going to leave it set to master, since it's likely to be the only device on that cable anyway. We'll go ahead and put the screws in here that hold this in place. This may have to be a two-part video, because like I said, I don't have any of these screws. I might have to take one to the hardware store to get a representative sample and figure out if they can help me supply more of them. They can help me get more of them, if they can supply more of them, something like that. It's not even that late at night, and I'm already messing up how I'm talking. It's not a good sign at all. We'll go ahead and tighten these two in place, and then the drive can just go in the case. And of course it wants to bind up. Nothing is ever simple, you know. That's right. Sometimes you have to just be able to engage in the great American pastime of hitting things to successfully get an optical drive installed in the computer. And of course you do want to make sure that before you make yourself look like a twit on YouTube and install the drive upside down, that it is in fact facing the right way up, as this drive is. Fortunately, moving on a little bit here, I was going to see if the front panel audio cables could be disconnected from the front panel portion of the case, and as it turns out they can. You can see that there are two header style connectors here, one of them for the USB ports, which I'll be keeping and using, complete with twiddly little separate ground wires that I don't know if they're actually connection points for on the motherboard. And then over here we have the audio header connectors, and I'm just going to go ahead and unplug those. Now, the first time I did this, I did make myself look like a bit of a twit, but luckily the video camera was not actually running at the time. I actually ended up pulling the USB header off of the circuit board while this was still mounted to the case. Fortunately, it simply unscrews and just uses a regular old computer case screw at that, so there was no great loss caused by that. And if I do decide that I want to keep the front panel audio functionality, again, try to get that cable here in view of the camera, the relatively standardized design of this, assuming that I can find one with the same pinout in another computer case or maybe on eBay or something like that, would suggest that I should be able to source a longer one of these. And if I can, I might actually do so for these previously built Athlon XP systems as I find something to do with them and put them back in service, because they have the same problem. Even though this is a micro ATX board, these audio connectors just don't reach, and I actually removed them because they were infringing on the third PCI slot, much as they do on this. Someone at Case Edge or Foxconn or whatever they were calling themselves that week did not really think that particular aspect of the design through. Go ahead and sneak these cables through here in an effort to get this thing reconnected. That audio cable, it just does not want to go away, does it? Does not want to do the polite thing. Now, let's see, I gotta remember how this was done. Of course, I've got another case over here to use as a reference, so I should probably do that. And this is probably going to be a two-hand job to fasten this screw. Maybe not. I don't know, that really doesn't look right. I'm going to pause the camcorder here. Well, we're creeping closer every second toward the first power-up of this machine. At least all these components in this case. I've made all the power connections to the optical drive. It's the only drive in the machine at the moment. When this thing is finished, it will have a floppy drive in place, mainly because that's something that, yes, I know, it's one of my obnoxious opinions. Insert cheesy reverb here. Real computers have floppy drives. Made the motherboard power connection, have the ribbon cable go into the parallel ATA optical drive, hooked up the front panel USB connections. There was an extra ground lead left over, and while I don't suppose that it's strictly necessary, you just never know when those bits are flying along at USB 2.0 speeds. So I went ahead and just stole the ground connection from the second front panel USB connector that will not be used in this particular build. Over here we have the various connectors going to the front panel. We have the hard drive LED, we have the power switch, and curiously separated, as previously mentioned from all the others, we have the power LED connection. And it will be interesting as we near preparations for the smoke test to see just how many of these have been connected, as in the ancient but still commonly and curiously often practiced art of plugging in the front panel LED connectors backwards. So I'll go ahead and pick this machine up because I think we're just about ready to go ahead and throw the front cover back on it here. Again, I really like the styling of these cases. Maybe they're not everybody's cup of tea, but they certainly appeal to me. And again, once again, as you can see, or more likely heard, being able to smack things is a skill that is essential to computer assembly. So let me go ahead and shuffle some things around here so there's a little bit of room to test all this stuff out and make all the connections and move things around and generally breathe. and we'll see if this thing goes ahead and proceeds to do anything useful, or if it makes 6-foot flames shoot out of everything. Now, I did discover, as I was moving toward completing the assembly of this computer, that the heatsink fan assembly does in fact have a maker's name printed on it. It is a Zalman heatsink and fan assembly, so a very real and very serious contender in the processor heatsink and fan cooling solution market. And I'm very glad to see that there, because although I have nothing against the stock Intel coolers, for the higher end Pentium 4s, they are just a little bit on the light side. It's now or never. We're in condition fit to power up, at least in theory. Got all the connections made, hooked up a monitor, mouse, keyboard, and power on the back. I just have to turn the big black switch on and see what happens. We're going to go ahead and do it. So all together, everybody out there in YouTube land, 3, 2, 1, smoke test! Well, the fans are running. Let's see if the front panel LEDs are working. No, not really. But we do have a power on self-test, and it looks like it's going to count up to 2 gigabytes of RAM. Should probably go ahead and enter setup on this machine just to see what's going on. And let's take a look at our equipment roster here. I wonder whatever possessed me to put this monitor so far away from the rest of the computer. Wasn't really the best idea in the whole world. We have an Intel Pentium 4 clocked at 3.4 gigahertz, so this is going to be a pretty sweet performer. That was just about as fast as the Pentium 4 ever officially went. I think there were a few 3.6s floating around, and maybe a 3.8 or 2, but I don't remember for sure. I know there were people overclocking them to an even 4 and maybe a little bit more than that, which, considering the blast furnace-like heat output of a Pentium 4, is really something that's a commendable feat. We should get these people to work on Core i7s and stuff, but they're probably doing that. So let's see what else we have here. We have 2 gigabytes of memory, 512 megabytes across 4 sockets, all of them DDR400. The system is keeping time, although as old as that system's clock battery is, I am going to go ahead and treat it to a new one. Now let's see here if we can make this power LED actually happen to work. There we go. It's a little bit dim, suggesting that maybe this motherboard doesn't quite drive it as optimally as it could, but it is working. So I guess the next thing we ought to do is go over here in the BIOS setup utility. I don't remember where Intel puts this. But we're going to check out the hardware monitoring and make sure that everything on this board is healthy, because we don't want the processor to burn up and cook itself, and with a Pentium 4 it's a very real possibility. But it looks like our power supply voltages are in check. I don't see one for the battery, so I don't know how good that is, but like I say, it's going to get replaced anyway. Our fans are in check, our temperatures look good, so I think the next step is to go ahead and try to boot some sort of a live operating system from a CD that is very probably in that optical drive right over there. One day later, probably $1 shorter, maybe even more than that the way things are going around here, and this thing is starting to look significantly more like a proper and finished computer. I actually did a lot of work today that I didn't happen to take video of because, well, I didn't figure it would be that exciting. Trips to the hardware store, fleshing out the hardware on this machine, all that sort of thing. So let's go ahead and pop the cover on it and take a look here. I somehow managed to misplace the original thumb screws for this computer, and the ones I got from the hardware store, while they're certainly serviceable, they're really not a masterpiece of usability. And they're also a good bit longer than normal computer case screws are. Look at how far that thing is coming out of there, and you'll see what I mean. Plus, these things are just kind of fiddly. The top one goes in kind of tight. The bottom one, I can almost kind of spin it out with my finger, and so it goes a lot faster. I might have been money ahead just to put regular screws on this, since I'm never very far away from a screwdriver down here anyway. But that's the story with those. Go ahead and pop the cover in here and see some of the stuff that I've been up to. As you can see, I've installed a floppy drive that was much more visible from the front of the case. Also ended up selecting a hard drive. This is something else that Max Arcade sent me. He sent me a couple of these 160 gigabyte or so Seagate hard drives. I think there were a few Mac stores in the bunch as well. All of them have some number of reallocated sectors, but you know what? I don't view that as a problem, and usually it isn't as long as they don't grow over time, and this drive seems to be okay. I was seriously considering using a serial ATA hard drive in this machine, because on the motherboard there are 2 serial ATA headers that could be used. But in the end, I didn't really have a serial ATA drive of the appropriate capacity for this project. The only one I had kicking around that seemed serviceable was a pair of 500 gigabyte Western Digital drives, and I decided that those were just overkill for what it was I had in mind to do with this machine. Though at some point I certainly would like to get a serial ATA drive. And you can see I've used some highly sophisticated cable management here. I'm not, as previously mentioned, at all a fan of zip ties in computers, and I know a lot of people have differed with me on this, and that's certainly their prerogative. But once again, I'm not really looking to have a discussion about that in the comments area. Everybody's philosophy differs when it comes to assembling a computer, and I respect that. I hope you'll respect mine as well. I did go ahead and replaced the clock battery in the system. Did that with the standby power on, so I didn't lose any of the system settings or anything along those lines. The clock stayed perfectly set. Most motherboards have no use for that battery whatsoever as long as they're plugged in and have standby power coming in from the power supply, but there are a few exceptions to that. Again, like I say, the cable management's not the most attractive thing in the world, but it is functional. I might try to clean it up a little bit later on. I am kind of surprised at how hot this power supply seems to be running, but it hasn't given up in several hours of burn-in operation so far. I did manage to come up with enough screws to get the various drives installed in this computer, though not quite in the way I had wanted to, and certainly not with the most appropriate types. Ordinarily, anybody that works on computers even halfway seriously has got tons of screws, but one of the things I've done down here recently is to massively reorganize this room, and now that I've organized it, I can't actually find anything. Fortunately, I did find a little baggie of leftover screws from another build, as well as a bunch of motherboard spacers in there, and I found some smaller than normal screws that seem to work acceptably well for mounting the floppy drive and the hard drive. The optical drive wasn't a problem, as you saw earlier in the video. I simply went ahead and transferred the mounting screws from one to the other. I did go to the hardware store to try and find screws of that type, but between 2 hardware stores I couldn't come up with anything even remotely like that. And although they were small hardware stores, both of them, it seems that they have a massively better screw selection than any of the big name hardware stores. So I don't know where you go to get those kind of screws. I might try eBay, I might try doing a search on the web, maybe they're available for purchase online. Another thing that I did, I wasn't going to do this originally, but it kept lingering in the back of my mind that I wanted to make the cooling in this system as effective as possible. Now, I don't think that these cases are what you could call badly cooled by any stretch of the imagination, but neither are they the best cooling cases that I have ever seen. And ordinarily in the front of this case, there's this twiddly little grill for a tiny fan, and what good is this going to do? This isn't going to do a whole lot of good. I have actually populated that cage on some of these other machines in the past, and it wasn't worth doing. There was just no point in doing that whatsoever. So what I have sitting down here in the front of the case is an Antec 3-speed fan. This was actually something that didn't cost me a dime. You know, the idea here has been to do this as cheap as possible, and so far I've been relatively successful with that idea. Back when I bought my last Antec P182B case, there was a note inside the case that said, due to a manufacturing defect, some of the fans that are pre-installed in this case may not function properly at their lower speeds. And so we are including 3 fans at absolutely no cost to you, should you find that any of your fans are affected by this issue. If the fans in the case do work, please accept these with our compliments. Probably not an exact quote, but definitely close enough. And fortunately, the fans in the P182 case I got were all perfectly functional at their lower speeds, so I simply kept the extras in storage and found something interesting to do with this one. It's the first of the 3 that I've used, but it's not really as effective as I would have hoped, because this is not the most well-designed aspect of this case. It certainly wasn't intended to have a fan here. The problem is all these little punched holes in the front of the case, they make for turbulence and they slow down the airflow. and they dramatically reduce the effectiveness of this fan. I've got it set on the medium speed. There's a little speed toggle switch right here tucked up out of the way, because if I turn it up to the high speed, I really think it gets kind of objectionably loud, and I'm not a guy who usually cares about fan noise too much in computers, but I do think I'm going to see about maybe removing these holes with some kind of a metal nibbler or something along those lines, although it would definitely be a good idea to take everything out of this case, because that tends to develop an expensive habit of eating motherboards if you try metalworking on a case that actually has a motherboard in it. But as I said before I got off on that subject, these are multi-speed fans, and on the highest fan speed, I think the fan noise is a little bit objectionable. You might agree or disagree, but I certainly wouldn't like to leave it there all the time, so I've simply got it running on the medium speed, and it does manage to move a little bit of air through here, and it has helped cut down the system temperatures just a little bit, but it's not as good as it could be. It's probably not the best thing to do with a spinning hard drive in there, you know that? Another thing that I did in the name of case ventilation, and unfortunately this has fallen over on the floor here, but I can still get it. I went ahead and covered up this duct. You'll notice this is very high-tech ventilation engineering here, and some might say that, well, it's an awfully bold move of you to second-guess the designers of the case, but I'm a big believer, and again, I know schools of thought differ here, that air should come in one end of the case and go out the other. There shouldn't be any intermediary or anything like that. So I went ahead and covered up this vent, and that also served to bring the temperatures down, not by a huge amount, but by a degree or two. The biggest improvement, as I said previously, I think it would come from opening up the area behind this plastic bezel and letting that fan draw in more air. That Antec fan should be powerful enough that I would think, even with the other fans going in this case, that it would be able to put things under positive pressure, actually have air coming out through things like the floppy drive, which, while certainly better for ventilation, is obviously not the best thing for keeping dust out of your computer. I'm going to go ahead and fasten these thumb screws again, because I'm pretty much done with the inside of this computer. I'm ready to go ahead and try to boot an operating system on it, and just for fun, and because it happens to be available readily in a live version like most Linux distributions, I can remember when that was a unique feature of something like Knoppix. Remember that? I don't even know if they're still developing that. I suppose they are. I remember how cool it seemed at the time to be able to boot up to a functional live Linux desktop from a read-only medium such as a CD or a DVD, but nowadays we practically take it for granted. So go ahead and get the 32-bit Linux Mint compact disc that I burned here. Pop it in compact disc. It's actually a DVD-R that I burned, and we'll go ahead and break out a system setup here and see if this machine will go ahead and boot it. I don't know if this drive will handle a rewritable disk well, but we're going to find out, because it's working on booting up. And then when I get done with this, I'll install Windows XP, and then I'll install Linux and set up all the dual booting aspects. But it looks like it at least made it to the startup point here. We'll see what happens in 1 second. Woohoo! It's always nice to see a computer come together like this, and especially when it works. I was thinking about it. But I won't bore you with that. I'll be right back after it's booted up. It has come to my realization that apparently I do not own a solitary working DVD recordable media blank of any kind. And my most recent failure was this, a DVD minus R disc. Well, I'll tell you what, if it won't burn in a regular burner, oh, we are gonna fix it good. Do not try this at home, and do not try it anywhere else for that matter. Seriously, don't try this at home. Kind of stinks. Let's see, I believe that disk should be well and truly burnt now. I'll go in and try and install Linux from it now. It's definitely kind of hot. Well, what should have been a very simple effort to download and burn to disk a Linux distribution has turned into a truly grand old adventure of epic proportions. I've had a lot of problems with optical disc media tonight. You see, I've got this spindle of cheap 2.4 speed DVD plus RW discs. They are cheap, no-name discs, but they have always worked well in a wide variety of equipment. And in fact, when I went to burn the copy of Linux Mint to DVD using the Inspiron 660S behind the Samsung panel and the lava lamp over there, had no problem. The disc burned fine, seemed to verify fine. But then I tried to boot it in this computer, and it sat there for the longest time. I let it go for like 10 minutes before I realized that it had probably lost the plot and wandered off somewhere from which it was never going to return. So I powered it off, booted it up again, and ran the media test. It failed about halfway through, so I decided maybe I got a bum disk. I pulled another one off the stack here. It burned and verified without incident. Tried it again, still failed the verification process. Now, the one thing that I don't have a heck of a lot of around here is blank DVD media of any kind, because the only time that I ever use it is when I'm burning software to a disk that's large enough to require more than a compact disc, writable disc, or a rewritable disc. So it's not something that I have a whole heck of a lot of. But I looked around and I tried to find another piece of media. Went into the Dell Dimension 8300 in the other room, tried to burn it there. That disk failed during the verification process and ended up in the microwave over there. Ultimately, what I found that actually happened to work was this, a Fujifilm branded DVD plus RW blank. This thing's been a little bit well loved, but it still seems pretty serviceable. I went ahead and burned it in the Dell Dimension 8300's optical drive in the other room. It bombed out at quad speed, but it worked just fine at double speed. And I went ahead and booted this machine up. It booted up just fine from this disk, so hopefully it'll do so again, because there's something I want to show you. It's one of those little things that makes the use of Linux for me, even though it's an operating system that I have an enormous amount of respect for, a death by 1,000 cuts kind of experience. And it's the reason why, to this very day, I do not use Linux on a daily basis. So let's go ahead, power this machine up, pop the disk into the drive, and while it's working on powering up, I want you to look at the Power On Self-Test screen. You can see that a legacy keyboard and a legacy mouse have both been detected. That's right, this machine has PS2 input peripherals connected to it. We have a Dell AT101W keyboard and a no-name PS2 mouse connected to this machine. And what happens when Linux Mint 17 happens to boot up is really very interesting and, frankly, incredibly stupid. But it looks like this machine is being stubborn about booting, so I guess I'll be right back. I didn't have this trouble with it the first time around. Maybe my luck has run out with this particular optical disc. I don't know. Okay, there we go. It took a little bit of encouragement, but it's going ahead and making all the right motions as concerns starting up right now. And although I don't intend to leave the camcorder running because it does take a while for this computer to boot from a live CD, there's a handy little feature I happened to stumble upon while having all this trouble with various optical discs that I wanted to share with you. You see, ordinarily when a Linux operating system boots, it displays a splash screen, and that's all well and good if everything happens to be working and the operating system is actually loading. But if it encounters a problem like a read error from the disk or anything along those lines, anything short of a kernel panic, it won't make a whole lot of noise about. And the only reason you'll know of a kernel panic is because it actually happens to blink the keyboard LEDs to indicate that something very serious has gone wrong. So what I discovered is that at least during the boot process of Linux Mint, you can press the downward pointing arrow on the keyboard, and the splash screen will be replaced with detailed information about the computer's startup process. So if it's going wrong, you can figure out exactly where it's going wrong at, and you might be able to figure out what to do about it, which is a very handy feature to have. Alright, so here we are at the Linux Mint desktop. Everything looks great. The monitor has been initialized and set to the correct mode. The onboard Intel video seems to be operating correctly. If we look down here at the corner of the screen, you can see that the system has even recognized the sound hardware, and it would appear that we have a network connection as well. But alas, all is not sweetness and light, because if we look at the middle of the screen, you will see a very familiar element of any graphical computing experience in the form of the mouse pointer. And guess what? You wouldn't know it because you can't see it, but I am moving the mouse right now, and the system is completely ignoring me. Just in case you're doubting me, go ahead and move the mouse some more, and I am being completely ignored. And this is exactly the kind of thing that does not fill one with confidence. And maybe it's different for you. If it is, I think that's wonderful, though it's also my highly esteemed opinion that you lead a charmed existence, because stupid stuff happens like this to me in Linux all the time. Now, for stuff that's a little bit off the beaten path, you know, I can understand that. The developers sometimes don't have access to all the hardware that the members of the using class do. And so they may not be able to make it work properly on their system or in all cases. But come on, we're talking about a PS2 mouse here plugged into the system board's PS2 port. This is a 25-plus-year-old hardware standard on a 10-year-old motherboard. And it doesn't work? What is wrong with these people? And just in case you're thinking, well, I could do a web search and look it up, I tried that. I did not find anything that suggested there being a problem with Linux Mint Release 17 and PS2 input devices. Needless to say, this is not filling me with confidence about setting this machine up to dual boot into Linux Mint 17. Although the PS2 mouse is down for the count, at least the keyboard seems to work. If I hit the Windows key over here, in just a moment we'll get a Mint menu full of applications. And the keyboard accessibility does work pretty well for this. You can choose an application. You could probably use the tab key to get around. You certainly wouldn't enjoy it, but at least it seems to be possible. However, the one thing that you seemingly can't do is reboot the machine strictly from the keyboard. The only way I have found so far to get the shutdown dialog to come up is to go ahead and gently touch the power button, which causes the system to detect that and ask if I would like to shut down the system. And of course, if I do nothing, it says that it will be shut down in 60 seconds. So I'd better hurry up here. I want to go ahead and choose restart and show you what happens when I do. I would recommend that you pay close attention to the BIOS Power On self-test screen when it starts enumerating some of the system's more basic hardware. I'll go ahead and remove the media from the drive, close the tray, because in this case there is one, and we'll press enter and the system will reboot. Check this out. The Intel BIOS goes through all the motions here, and look what's missing. Whatever Linux Mint screwed up regarding the detection of the PS2 mouse, it prevented the system BIOS from reinitializing board resident hardware and getting it ready to go again. And that, in my opinion, is really, really trying. That takes an extra special amount of effort. So I'm not overly optimistic about this system running Linux well, which is really unfortunate because this is old hardware and something like this just absolutely should not happen. Now, I am neither stupid nor lazy. Okay, that's not entirely true. I actually am pretty lazy, but I'm certainly not stupid. Although it seems like my adventures with Linux eventually lead to the point where I'm feeling as though I must be stupid for not being able to get this to work. And that sort of a situation is simply inexcusable. Now, don't get me wrong here. I have a feeling I'm going to get a lot of pushback about this in the comments, and I certainly don't mind having a rational discussion about it. I don't mean to say that other operating systems of any kind or from any vendor are perfect. In fact, I've certainly had some terrible adventures, misadventures probably, actually, more correctly, in other operating systems. But the one thing that seems to be guaranteed to be true, at least with my experiences within the Linux operating system, is that trying to correct even relatively simple, straightforward problems, even problems whose cause I readily understand, turns into a nightmarish experience of unwise twiddling around in barely documented configuration files using information that's not even remotely up to date, and that situation is just completely, utterly inexcusable and ridiculous. Okay, enough of that. I'm getting off my soapbox now. Might as well go ahead to another part of this effort, and that's to try and install Windows. Got a Windows XP bootable CD-ROM in the computer's optical drive. wait for it to do the power on self-test thing here, and see if it will proceed to boot that CD. But I certainly expect that it will do so. So at the very least I can get that working, if nothing else, and I can come a little bit closer to putting an end toward this video epic, which it's looking like it's going to be on the order of at least an hour long, and that's just, wow. Even for my measure of long-windedness, that is really saying something. So I'm not going to make you sit through the entire Windows installation. I'll go ahead and take care of that, and thanks to the magic of video editing, we will be right back to try and wrap this thing up for once and for all. As I'm shooting this particular portion of the video, all of the video that I have previously shot and edited has totaled to a running time of 1 hour and 4 minutes. This is by far and away the longest YouTube video that I have ever produced and uploaded to the site. I hope it will upload. I'm in the midst of shooting it right now, so I don't know yet, but I'm an optimist. I'd like to think that it will upload, although my internet connection, the tin can and string that link me to the outside world, may be nothing but a smoking ruin by the time I am done. For those of you who have made it this far into the video, and I don't know how many that can be, you need not be told of what an epic this otherwise simple project has turned into. I hit some unexpected roadblocks along the way, and I actually had to step back from the project and take some time off. You know, it's always a good thing to do when you think that your temper is about to get the better of you, just to step back, walk away, and do something else. So that's what I did. It's about a week later. I'm back, and I'm ready to tell you about some of the problems that I had and some of the things that I learned. One of the biggest problems that I ran into by far and away was with optical media. Now maybe all you modern kids out there in the world today think, ooh, someone's using optical media, how quaint. Well, maybe so, but it's what I'm used to and it's what I liked. I started out with these cheap no-name DVD plus RW blanks. I've never had any trouble with these despite their cheap stature. They're a couple of years old. I bought them, I think, off a Newegg at some point in the past, along with an optical drive. I really couldn't tell you, but they're probably about 4 or 5 years old. And up until now, they had always served me very well. When Weasel2HTM came here, he was kind enough to leave me a couple of these DVD-ROM, CD rewritable capable drives. Unfortunately, these drives did not like that DVD plus RW media one bit. I could burn a disk and have it pass the verification run in the computer that created the disk. I even tried burning the disks on 2 different computers, and the result was the same. I tried various burn speeds, I tried everything I could think of, and no matter what I did, these drives were having none of it. I finally managed to find an updated firmware for these drives because apparently Lite-On's optical drive operations have been merged with other companies over time, and nothing is left on their site. I did, however, find the last released firmware for these drives, and knowing that that sometimes can help, I tried applying it. It didn't make any difference. The verification still failed at 50%. So I made a venture out, and I picked up some brand new DVD plus R media. I wish I could say the results were any better with that, but they weren't. The best results I had during this entire process, the only disc that I made that even thought about booting, we'll see if I can actually get at it here, was this slightly bruised Fujifilm DVD plus RW disc that I found. And it wasn't in the best of shape. In fact, I burned this disc at double speed and it failed. So I slowed it down and it succeeded, and the machine did actually manage to boot from that disc. I hadn't learned my lesson yet though. We'll get to that in just a moment, what the ultimate lesson I came away with happened to be. So I tried a couple more of the optical drives that Weasel2HTM was kind enough to leave here, and I don't know if these were particularly well-used drives, or they just sat around too long, or what the deal might be, but they didn't like it any better. In fact, the one of them on the right actually totally bombed out trying to read any of the discs that I had burned. I'm not sure if it's the fault of these drives or not, because up here you can see a new old stock Asus branded, probably manufactured by Lite-On, CB5216A combo drive, a DVD reader and a CD burner. And although that drive is new in the box, I bought it new, has never been used or anything along those lines, it wasn't having any part of those discs either. So I ended up switching to yet another optical drive. This Wrightmaster drive with the black front on it, which would look terrible in a white computer case such as this, actually happened to work perfectly. But unfortunately, I was kind of being a stickler for detail about my computer case. Well, I finally learned my lesson. Yes, I did. Not only did I find one of these DVD-ROM CDRW drives that worked, I also tried some DVD minus RW media, because these are both plus R and plus RW discs here. This disc still ran into trouble with these other two drives, but it worked on this third one. But that's not how I ultimately solved the problem. Eventually I quit beating my head against the wall, and I prepared a bootable USB stick containing Linux Mint 17. Now that certainly worked and the machine started up, but then I ran into another problem. I've already gone into a great rant about the miserable situation involving Linux Mint and pointing devices that I soon found myself involved in. But for those of you who are curious as to what was going on and what I ultimately determined the problem to be, here's a much more rational, reasoned look at the situation after I'd calmed down and gotten off of my soapbox. For quite some time now, here on the Computer Project's workbench, I've been using this cheap, no-name, dual-scroll wheel-equipped mouse. This is just your average no-name Chinese mouse. I undoubtedly picked it up very cheaply at a thrift store somewhere, and as previously mentioned, I've gotten along very well with it. But when I attempted to start up Linux Mint on the project computer that I've been working on, I discovered, much to my chagrin, that the mouse pointer was completely frozen. And what was worse than that, when I managed to reboot the system, I discovered that the BIOS would not list the mouse in its roster of basic input-output devices that it checked for during its startup process. So I decided to do a little bit of diagnosis here and see what was actually going on. As you've seen previously in this video, I have a number of AMD Athlon XP machines, at least two of which are in here right now. So I grabbed one of those, plugged this same mouse into it, and booted that machine's normally installed operating system, a copy of Windows 2000. I discovered that the mouse worked normally, so I took my bootable Linux Mint installation media and I proceeded to boot that machine. Now, I honestly expected the result might change because the Athlon XP based machines have a different chipset. They also have a different low pin count I/O controller, which is the component that is responsible for not only system housekeeping tasks and power management related stuff, but also inputs from things like parallel, serial, and PS2 ports. Well, I discovered that the mechanism of the failure was exactly the same on the Athlon XP machine. I also discovered that if I did a soft boot and went back into the machine's normal operating system, that the mouse remained unresponsive in addition to not being detected by the BIOS. So it seemed that something about Linux Mint was actually serving to crash the mouse, if you can believe it. I've never heard of something like that either. I thought it was pretty outlandish at first. So I went ahead and broke out my golden screwdrivers and I popped this mouse apart. And what I soon discovered is that this mouse is manufactured by a company that some of you may have heard of in the past, a big, no-name Chinese, Taiwanese powerhouse manufacturer of fairly generic, as well as branded under their own name, keyboards and mice, a company by the name of A4 Technology, or A4 Tech for short. This mouse was manufactured by them. It's driven by one of their integrated circuits. And lo and behold, when I punched that into Google along with some carefully selected search terms, I discovered that there is apparently a long-standing bug in Ubuntu Linux derivatives, of which Linux Mint is certainly a member. That bug, which has been around since 2009, and they certainly don't seem to be in any hurry to solve it, affects various A4 Tech mice in different ways. The person who opened the bug reported that their mouse was exceptionally click-happy, but a couple of people who issued follow-up reports noticed behavior similar to what I had noticed, where the mouse completely hangs up and stops responding. So apparently mice made by A4 Tech may not work properly under Ubuntu and its derivatives. So I simply switched to another kind of mouse over here, this good old trusty Microsoft. This is not a scroll mouse, this is simply the Mouseport compatible mouse 2.0A. You can find these things laying around everywhere, and with that, the problem happened to vanish. Now, I would have been perfectly content to continue using this mouse, just like its generic counterpart. It works very well, but I am a completely spoiled person, spoiled by the convenience aspect of the scroll wheel. I didn't want to give that up. So ultimately, I went with this Hewlett-Packard mouse, which is not only optically tracked, it's also a PS2 port-only mouse. It was manufactured by Primax Electronics, which you probably can't really see because of the clear casing, which is absolutely cool looking, though it serves very little practical purpose, and this mouse works very perfectly as well. These are pretty nice, actually, as far as a PS2 only mouse goes. The only complaint I have about optical mice, and this probably isn't an issue for a person who's never used a ball style mouse such as this, these old ball mice typically have a rubber shroud around a ball bearing. That is to say, at the center of their rubber ball, there is a ball bearing inside there to give the mouse some weight. And these optical mice, it just feels like something is missing by comparison because that weight is not there. But never mind any of that. I was glad to have the situation resolved at long last, even if I thought that the root cause was a bit silly. And that brings us finally to the part that you really came here to hear about, and that's the part where I go ahead and power this machine up and actually get around to installing Linux Mint. Now, one of the things that I recommend when you have a computer project going on is a nice cool drink. And being as computers can sometimes be quite annoying devices, I recommend that drink not be something that's alcoholic in origin, because otherwise things are likely to go from bad to much, much worse. We're booting up Linux Mint right now from the USB stick that I made. Interestingly, I have noticed that Linux Mint does not boot much faster from a USB flash memory stick than it did from optical media when the optical media was working properly. I don't know if this is some sort of an emulation issue, if maybe the BIOS is handling the USB storage emulation so that Linux can boot from it, and it's quite a while until the kernel manages to take over, or exactly what might be going on along those particular lines. We'll go ahead and let Linux boot up here, and I'll be right back to go ahead and run the installer. Somewhere along the line, and for no particularly good reason, I wanted to share with you something interesting that I found in this computer system when I was putting the case together and putting all the components into their final places. I meant to talk about this much earlier, but somehow I just never got around to it, probably because I got too distracted by all the ranting that I was doing. This is your average floppy disk drive cable. It's not very exciting to look at, but I was very surprised to see that whoever did the original assembly on these systems, I know the company, but I don't know the people who actually did the work, for whatever reason, they chose to use a floppy diskette cable with not one position, but actually two positions for floppy drive A, here with the twist in the cable, which actually inverts the addressing logic so that the system can recognize drive A, and then down here another cable end for an optional disk drive B. I was very surprised to see that they used such a long cable. Maybe it was just a matter of what they had handy. It's certainly not that much of an interesting thing to talk about, but I thought it would make just an interesting little random kind of a sidebar thing. Since I did end up using a floppy drive in this build, I went ahead and kept a floppy cable in there, but I replaced this one with one that has support for only a single drive, just to cut down on some of the cable jungle that was running around inside the case. And would you look at that, we have a working mouse pointer. Isn't that awesome? So let's go ahead and take that mouse pointer over here and choose to install Linux Mint. Now, it's been so long since I've done this that I don't know if I've made all the right decisions. One of the decisions that I did make when I was setting up Windows was to leave about half of the hard drive empty. Linux can resize a Windows operating system partition in preparation for a dual boot environment, but I thought I might make things a little easier by leaving about half of the hard drive open. I guess we're going to find out whether or not that was actually a good idea. Now, this video is not going to contain a step-by-step guide to installing Linux. If you want that, I'm sure that you can find it online. You can probably even find another video about it. But the step-by-step thing is not something that I'm really keen on. This is just sort of a rambling adventure into one man's unwise tinkering with computers, computer hardware, operating systems, and of course computer mice as well. The installation run for Linux Mint completed successfully. I went ahead and opted to shut the computer down. Let's go ahead and see what happened, and if everything worked out the way that I expected it will. I've gone ahead and removed the USB stick because I don't want the machine to boot up from that. So we'll go ahead and hit the power button and just see what ends up happening here. The only thing I'm concerned about is whether or not Linux managed to appropriately configure the hard drive. If it noticed the unused portion that I left open for it, about half the drive, and managed to use it, or if it tried to further subdivide the Windows partition. But here we have a boot menu. Windows XP is on the bottom. We have a couple other options here. I probably have to be careful. This might time out. We have two recovery options. One recovery option, memory test, and memory test over serial console, which is an interesting option. I haven't used a serial console on a system in quite a while. The last time I did that was a couple of years ago when I was playing around with an RS6000 machine running AIX 5.1L from IBM. So go ahead and boot into Windows here and take a quick look at the disk layout of the machine. There do exist various Linux file system drivers for Windows, so if you need to see your file system, your file systems and your volumes under Linux on Windows, you can certainly do that. I've used a driver that allows access to ext2 volumes, which has been quite a while ago. I think that ext4 is the current situation for most Linux users right now. But let's go ahead and just open up the computer management window here and see what's going on over in disk management land. And look at this. I think it has done very well. We have a 74.5 gigabyte NTFS system partition. That'll be the Windows volume right there. Sitting right next to it, we have a 72.5 gigabyte unknown partition. That's likely to be the Linux boot and storage partition. And then over here we have a 2 gigabyte, basically, unknown partition of another type. This is probably a Linux swap partition. I also noticed something else that was interesting about this system. Earlier in this video, when I looked at the central processing unit statistics, I discovered that this machine is spec'd with a 3.4 gigahertz socket 478 Pentium 4 CPU. And at first I thought, well, that must be a Prescott, because the Prescott was certainly the popular choice for the faster socket 478 Pentium 4 processors. But there were equally fast Northwoods created during that time as well, but they are quite unusual. 2.8 gigahertz, 3 gigahertz, 3.2, and even 3.4 gigahertz Northwood processors exist, and much to my amazement, this machine is packing a 3.4 gigahertz Northwood Pentium 4, which, while it doesn't have the extended cache of the Prescott series and it doesn't have SSE 3 instruction capability, it is a cooler running and, according to many people, better performing chip than the Prescott is. So if you don't need the larger cache and you don't need the SSE 3 instruction support, you will probably get better performance from the Northwood chip, as well as cooler operation as compared to a Prescott, or as many people call them, the Press Hot. And they are not kidding. I had a 3.4 gigahertz Prescott in a Dell Dimension 8300 that I bought new back in the day, and that processor was, to be very blunt about it, a lemon. Let's go ahead and boot out of Windows here. Go ahead and shut Windows down. I'm running a little bit low on camera memory here, so we'll have to make this quick. But at least that means that the end of the video is in sight, and I thank you for having stuck it out with me for so long. I'll bet we're up to an hour and a half by now if I had to guess. But this video epic is finally going to come to an end, and what's even better than that, it's a happy ending. So we'll get past the Intel desktop board sign-on message here, and we'll get to the boot manager, and we'll take the first option to boot into Linux Mint normally. And here we are at last, booted up very nicely into the Linux Mint operating environment. Everything is working very well, from the Intel integrated graphics, which are really all that I need, to the onboard sound and the built-in networking adapter. Now, as concerns the edition of Linux Mint that I'm actually using, I thought that I would run the Cinnamon edition at first, and it seemed like it ran fine on this machine when I tested it after getting the live boot media issue sorted out, but I ultimately decided to go with the XFCE desktop version, being as this is older hardware, and anything that can be done to lessen the load on the hardware is always a good idea. I do have some software updates to run. I would like to perhaps get into a little more detail on the hardware and maybe even do some stuff along the lines of setting up a virtual machine solution within Windows and Linux both, so that you can boot the alternative, the other operating system, the one that's currently idle on the disk, using something like VirtualBox. I've done that in the past. It actually works reasonably well. But we are out of time for today, and so I thank those of you in the audience who have stuck with me throughout this entire epic. And I leave you with a little bit of YouTube video playback testing. This machine does very well, at least when it comes to playing YouTube video in standard definition, as you will soon see. Rest you there for just a moment. I figured you would need a keyboard. And right there's about the point where I managed to break everything that was on the top of that shelf. Thank you for watching. Thank you for sticking with me throughout the entirety of this incredibly, epically long video that I have made. And please, feel free to leave a comment if you have one.